The grave digger found a living baby in what should have been an empty coffin and named her Hope. The shovel felt lighter in Samuel's hands now than it had 20 years ago, though his back told a different story. Each morning he walked the same path through Broken Creek, past the mercantile where Mrs. Henderson would turn her face away, past the saloon where men fell silent when his shadow crossed their doorway. He carried death with him like dust on his clothes, and the living knew to keep their distance. Samuel McKenna had buried more souls than any man should, mothers who died birthing babies that followed them 3 days later, miners crushed under rock that promised gold but delivered only darkness, children taken by fever, their small bodies light as kindling in his arms. Each grave he dug was a promise kept to the dead, but the living wanted nothing to do with promises that smelled like earth and endings. His cabin sat at the edge of a cemetery, close enough that he could hear the wind move through the headstones at night. Most folks thought it strange, living so near to all that death. But Samuel found comfort in the quiet. The dead made better neighbors than most of the living he'd known. They didn't judge. They didn't whisper. They just rested in the ground he'd given them, patient and still. The cemetery stretched across 2 acres of hard dirt and scattered sage, marked by wooden crosses that leaned with age and weather. Some graves had proper stones, carved with names and dates by families who could afford such things. Others held only a pile of rocks or a piece of driftwood painted with fading letters. Samuel remembered them all. Every name, every face, every last word spoken over their graves. He'd been 17 when he dug his first grave for old Pete Donnelly, who died drunk in the street on a Tuesday morning. The town needed someone to put Pete in the ground, and Samuel needed the $2 they offered. 20 years later, he was still digging, still putting folks to rest, still taking their coins and keeping their secrets buried deep. The work had carved lines around his eyes and bent his shoulders forward, as if he carried the weight of all those bodies even after they were lowered down. His hands were calloused thick as leather, scarred from rocks and roots and the sharp edges of broken coffins. He was 43 years old and looked older, with gray threading through his brown hair and silence settled deep in his bones. Samuel had learned not to ask too many questions about the people he buried. Families told him what they wanted him to know, paid him what they could, and left him to his work. Some graves held stories he was better off not knowing. Some coffins came to him already sealed, and he'd learned to leave them that way. But the storm that came in late September changed everything. It started as a whisper of wind that made the cottonwoods dance, then grew into something wild and angry. The sky turned the color of old brass, heavy with clouds that rolled like smoke across the horizon. Samuel watched it come from his cabin window, seeing the lightning flicker in the distance like a broken lantern. He'd weathered plenty of storms in his years at the cemetery. The dead didn't mind rain, and neither did he. But this storm came with a fury that made the windows rattle and the earth shake. Thunder crashed like God himself was angry, and the rain fell in sheets so thick Samuel couldn't see the headstones 20 feet away. All night the storm raged, turning the cemetery into a lake of mud and standing water. Samuel lay in his narrow bed, listening to the wind tear at his roof and the rain hammer against his door. He'd lived through worse weather, but something about this storm felt different. It felt like change coming, like the kind of rain that washed away more than just dust. When morning came, the storm moved on, leaving behind a world transformed. The cemetery was flooded, with water standing ankle-deep between the graves. Headstones tilted at new angles, and the careful rows Samuel had maintained were now marked by pools of muddy water that reflected the clearing sky. He pulled on his boots and waded out to check the damage, carrying his shovel and a heavy heart. Some of the newer graves had settled, their dirt washed away to leave shallow depressions in the mud. A few wooden crosses had been knocked flat, and he'd need to set them right again. The work of 20 years, rearranged by a single night of rain. It was near the back corner of the cemetery, where the oldest graves lay forgotten under twisted mesquite trees, that Samuel found the broken coffin. The wooden box had been buried shallow, probably 15 years ago or more. The storm had washed away enough dirt to expose the rotting planks, and the water had done the rest. The old wood had given way, split open like a seed pod, spilling its contents into the muddy water. Samuel expected to find bones, maybe scraps of cloth, or the remains of whatever poor soul had been laid to rest in such a cheap box. He'd seen plenty of disturbed graves over the years, and the sight of old remains didn't trouble him anymore. But what he found in that broken coffin made him drop his shovel in the mud. A baby, alive, crying. She was small, maybe 6 months old, wrapped in a blanket that should have been rotted away years ago, but somehow remained whole. Her skin was pale but warm, her tiny fists waving in the morning air as she wailed with the fury of someone who'd been kept waiting too long. Samuel stood in the ankle-deep water, staring down at this impossible thing. His mind tried to make sense of what he was seeing, but sense had nothing to do with it. Here was life where there should have been death, a baby where there should have been bones, breath where there should have been dust. He looked around the empty cemetery, half expecting to see someone watching, someone who could explain this miracle or curse. But there was only silence and the sound of water dripping from the trees. The baby's cries echoed off the headstones, the first sound of the living the cemetery had heard in all the years Samuel had tended it. Slowly, carefully, Samuel reached down and lifted the child from the broken coffin. She was real and solid in his arms, her small body warm against his chest. Her blanket was dry somehow, as if the water that had destroyed her wooden tomb had refused to touch her. She had dark hair that curled damp against her head and eyes that were gray as storm clouds. When Samuel held her, she stopped crying and looked up at him with the serious expression of someone much older, as if she understood exactly where she was and how strange it was to be there. Samuel had held many things in his 20 years of digging graves. Bodies stiff with death, coffins heavy with sorrow, the weight of other people's grief. But he had never held anything that felt so much like hope as this small girl who should not have been alive. Standing there in the flooded cemetery with the impossible child in his arms, Samuel felt something shift inside him, like a door opening in a house that had been locked for years. For 2 decades, he had been the keeper of endings, the man who put things to rest. Now, for the first time, he was holding a beginning. The baby made a soft sound, almost like she was trying to speak, and Samuel found himself whispering back to her without thinking. "I know," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "I know you don't belong here, either." But as he carried her toward his cabin, Samuel realized that maybe belonging wasn't about where you came from. Maybe it was about where you chose to stay, and what you chose to protect when the storms came to wash everything else away. Samuel named her Hope because that was what she felt like in his arms, something he'd forgotten he could hold. For 3 days, he kept her hidden in his cabin, learning the rhythm of her needs like he'd once learned the rhythm of digging graves. She woke before dawn, hungry and demanding, her cries cutting through the silence he'd grown used to over 20 years. His hands, rough from decades of shovel work, trembled the first time he tried to feed her. Mrs. Henderson at the mercantile sold him milk in bottles without asking questions, though her eyes lingered on his purchases with the curiosity of someone who sensed a story. Samuel paid in coins and silence, the way he'd learned to handle most of his business in Broken Creek. The cabin felt different with hope in it. Smaller, somehow, but also more alive. Sunlight through the single window seemed brighter when it fell across her blanket. The creaking of old wood at night sounded less lonely when mixed with her soft breathing. Samuel found himself moving quieter, speaking softer, as if the presence of something so small and fragile had changed the very air around them. He made a cradle from an old wooden crate, padding it with quilts his mother had sewn before the fever took her 15 years past. Hope slept in it by the window where she could see the sky, her tiny fists curled against her cheeks like flower buds waiting for spring. Sometimes Samuel would sit in his chair and just watch her sleep, amazed that something so peaceful could exist in a world that had shown him mostly sorrow. Learning to care for her was like learning a new language. Her different cries meant different things: hunger, wetness, the simple need to be held. Samuel, who had spent years listening to the wind move through headstones, now listened to the small sound she made in her sleep. He discovered that his scarred hands, which had only known the hardness of dirt and stone, could be gentle enough to touch her soft hair without waking her. The town began to notice his trips to the mercantile. Samuel had always kept to himself, buying only what he needed: coffee, beans, the occasional bottle of whiskey for the cold nights. Now he was purchasing milk, soft foods, cloth for washing. Word spread the way it always did in small places, carried on whispers and glances. "Heard the grave diggers got himself a woman," someone said at the saloon. "Maybe took sick," suggested another. "Been buying strange things lately." Samuel let them wonder. The truth would have been harder to explain than any lie they could imagine. How do you tell people that the dead had given up one of their own? That life had come from a place where only endings were supposed to rest? But on the fourth night, as Samuel sat feeding hope by lamplight, someone knocked on his door. The sound was soft but persistent, not the heavy pounding of someone drunk or angry. Samuel set the baby in her cradle and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. Two figures stood on his porch, a man and woman he didn't recognize, both dressed in travel clothes dusty from the road. "Mr. McKenna." The woman's voice was tired but determined. "We'd like to speak with you, if we may." Samuel opened the door just wide enough to see their faces. The woman was maybe 30, with dark hair pinned back and eyes that held the kind of sadness he recognized from funeral parlors. The man beside her was older, with gray in his beard and hands that rested easy on the gun at his hip. "We're looking for someone," the woman continued. "A child. We heard you might know something about children who've gone missing." Samuel's blood went cold, but his face remained steady. 20 years of dealing with grief had taught him to keep his emotions buried deep. "Don't know anything about missing children," he said. "I deal with the dead, not the living." The man stepped forward slightly, his eyes scanning what he could see of the cabin's interior. "We've been traveling from town to town, following a trail. Some folks take children, sell them to families who can't have their own. Others," he paused, "others do worse things. There was a baby girl," the woman said, her voice breaking slightly. 6 months old, taken from her family 3 months ago. We think she might have been brought through here." Behind him, Samuel heard Hope make a soft sound in her sleep. The visitor's attention sharpened, and he saw recognition dawn in the woman's eyes. She'd heard that sound before, the particular way a baby breathes when dreaming. "That's her," the woman whispered, taking a step forward. "That's Lucy. I know her sounds." Samuel's hand tightened on the door frame. "Don't know what you're talking about. Got no children here." But the woman was already crying, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "Please," she said. "She's my sister's child. My sister died of fever, and Lucy disappeared the same night. We think someone took her, thinking she was dead too. Please, if you have her." The man's hand moved closer to his gun, not threatening, but ready. "We're not here to cause trouble," he said. "We just want the child back where she belongs." Samuel stood in the doorway, feeling the weight of impossible choices. Behind him, Hope, Lucy, made another small sound. 3 months ago, someone had taken this baby from her family. Someone had buried her alive in a cheap coffin, thinking she was dead from the same fever that had claimed her mother. And somehow, by miracle or curse, she had survived until the storm opened her wooden tomb. "The child in there," Samuel said slowly. "Where did she come from? Originally?" The woman wiped her eyes with a shaking hand. "Sweetwater, 3 towns east. Her mother was my sister, Sarah. Sarah and her husband both died of fever within days of each other. We came as soon as we heard, but Lucy was already gone. Someone told us they'd seen a man taking children from homes where the fever had struck, selling them to families who asked no questions." Samuel thought of the shallow grave where he'd found Hope, of the rotted coffin that had given way in the storm. Someone had buried this baby thinking she was dead, or wanting her to be. Someone had tried to erase her from the world, and only chance had brought her back to light. "If she's in there," the man said quietly, "we can prove she belongs with us." Sarah left things, Letters, a locket with Lucy's hair. We can show you. Samuel looked from the woman's tear-stained face to the man's steady eyes, then back into his cabin, where Hope lay sleeping in the cradle he'd made from scraps of wood. For 4 days, she had been his miracle, his reason to wake up with purpose instead of just duty. She had taught his rough hands to be gentle, his silent house to hold laughter, his empty heart to hope for something beyond tomorrow's grave. But looking at the woman's face, Samuel saw something he recognized from 20 years of funerals, the particular grief of someone who had lost family, who carried the weight of love with nowhere to put it. The dead had given him hope, but the living had come to claim her. And Samuel McKenna, who had spent his life serving both, now had to decide which debt carried more weight. "Come back in the morning," he said finally. "Bring your proof. We'll talk then." As he closed the door, Samuel heard the woman sob with what might have been relief or despair, and he realized that some burdens were too heavy to carry alone, no matter how strong your back had grown from years of digging graves. Samuel didn't sleep that night. He sat in his chair by Hope's cradle, watching her small chest rise and fall in the lamplight, listening to the soft sound she made while dreaming. Every few minutes he would reach down and touch her hand, just to feel the warmth of her skin, to prove to himself that she was real and alive and still there. The woman's words echoed in his mind. "That's Lucy. I know her sounds." 3 months of searching, following a trail of stolen children and buried secrets. 3 months of grief carried like stones in the chest. Samuel understood that kind of weight. He'd been carrying his own stones for 20 years. When morning came gray and quiet, Samuel made coffee with shaking hands. Hope woke hungry, and he fed her slowly, memorizing the way she looked up at him while she drank, her gray eyes serious and trusting. She didn't know that everything was about to change. She didn't know that love sometimes meant letting go. The knock came at 8 o'clock, soft and respectful. Samuel opened the door to find the same 2 visitors, but now they looked different in the morning light. The woman's name was Martha, she told him, and she was the aunt of the child they called Lucy. The man was Thomas, Martha's husband, a sheriff from a county 2 days' ride south. They had been searching for 3 months, following rumors and whispers, tracking a network of people who took children from homes touched by death. "The fever came through Sweetwater last spring," Martha explained, sitting at Samuel's small table while Hope played on a blanket nearby. "Took near half the town. Sarah and her husband John were among the first to die. When we got word and came to help, Lucy was gone. The neighbors said a man came during the night, claiming to be family, said he was taking the baby to safety." Thomas spread papers on the table, letters in a woman's handwriting, a small silver locket, a birth record from the church in Sweetwater. "Sarah wrote to Martha every week," he said, told her about Lucy's first tooth coming in, how she liked to grab at sunbeams through the window, how she made different sounds when she was happy versus hungry. Samuel looked at the evidence while Hope babbled softly to herself, unaware that these strangers were discussing her fate. The letters described a baby who sounded exactly like the child he'd found in the broken coffin. The locket held a curl of dark hair that matched Hope's perfectly. "The man who took her," Martha continued, her voice steady but strained, "we tracked him to 2 other towns. He was working with people who buried children they thought were dead from fever, then sold them to families who couldn't have their own. But something went wrong with Lucy. Maybe she got sick on the road. Maybe they thought she was dying. They buried her outside of town, probably figured she'd be dead by morning anyway." Samuel's hands clenched into fists. The idea of someone burying this child alive, leaving her to die in a wooden box, filled him with a rage he hadn't felt since his early days of grief. "How do you know all this?" "We found the man," Thomas said quietly. "He's in jail now, along with 2 others. When we pressed him, he admitted to burying a baby girl outside Broken Creek. Said she was dying anyway. Said it was a mercy." Martha's eyes filled with tears. She wasn't dying. She was just sick like children get. Sarah wrote that Lucy had a fever but was getting better. They took her thinking she wouldn't live, and when she didn't improve fast enough, she couldn't finish the sentence. Samuel looked down at Hope, who was now pulling at the edges of her blanket, her small fingers working with the concentration of someone solving an important puzzle. She was healthy now, bright-eyed and curious, with no sign of the sickness that had nearly killed her. The storm that broke open her grave had been her salvation. "There's more," Thomas said, hesitating. "The family that was supposed to buy her, they live about 50 miles north of here. When a man didn't deliver, they got suspicious. Started asking questions. Word is they're still looking for a baby girl, and they're not the kind to give up easy." Samuel's blood went cold. "What kind of people?" "The kind who pay good money for children and don't ask where they come from," Martha said. "The kind who might come looking if they hear about a grave digger who suddenly has a baby." Samuel thought of his trips to the mercantile, the curious looks, the whispered conversations. News traveled fast in small towns, and if these people were still searching, it wouldn't take long for word to reach them. "You have to understand," Martha continued, "we're not just her family. We're her protection. Thomas has legal authority, and we have resources to keep her safe. If she stays here, she's in danger," Samuel finished, the words tasting like dirt in his mouth. "Yes," Thomas said simply. Samuel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the cemetery where he'd found Hope 5 days ago. 5 days that had changed everything. 5 days of learning what it meant to have someone depend on him for more than just a hole in the ground. 5 days of discovering that his heart wasn't as buried as he'd thought. "She's brought light to this place," he said quietly. "First time in 20 years I've had a reason to wake up that wasn't about death." Martha joined him at the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "I know what she means to you," she said. "I can see it in how you look at her, how careful you are when you touch her. Sarah would have been grateful that someone loved Lucy when she couldn't." Samuel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 20 years pressing down on his shoulders. All those graves he'd dug, all those people he'd put to rest. He'd thought his job was about endings, but maybe it had always been about letting go. Maybe that's what love really was, knowing when to hold on and when to set free. Hope made a happy sound from her blanket, and Samuel turned to see her reaching toward Martha with open arms. Martha knelt down, and Hope grabbed at her hair, babbling in the way babies do when they're pleased with something. Martha laughed through her tears, a sound that filled the cabin with warmth. "She knows," Martha whispered. "Somehow she knows." Samuel watched them together and saw something that made his chest tight with understanding. This wasn't about taking Hope away from him. This was about bringing her home. Martha had the same dark hair as Hope, the same serious gray eyes. When she held the baby, they looked like they belonged together in a way that no amount of wishing could create. That evening, after Martha and Thomas had returned to town to prepare for the journey back to Sweetwater, Samuel sat alone with Hope in the gathering darkness. She was fussy, sensing perhaps that change was coming, and he walked the small space of his cabin, humming songs he'd half remembered from his own childhood. "You know what I learned today?" he whispered to her as she finally settled in his arms. "Love isn't about keeping something for yourself. It's about making sure it ends up where it belongs, even when that place isn't with you." Hope yawned, her small hand curled around his finger, and Samuel felt his heart break and heal at the same time. Tomorrow he would have to let her go. Tomorrow he would have to trust that the people who had searched for her would love her as much as he had learned to in 5 short days. But tonight, she was still his hope. Tonight, he could still pretend that some miracles were meant to stay buried in the ground where you found them. As Samuel finally laid her in her cradle for the last time, he realized that the hardest graves to dig weren't for the dead. They were for the parts of yourself you had to bury so that someone else could live. The wagon wheels turned steady as heartbeats across the hard-packed earth, carrying Samuel and Hope towards Sweetwater under a sky stretched thin and blue. Martha and Thomas had offered to take the baby themselves, but Samuel asked for the chance to bring her home. He needed to see where she belonged. He needed to finish what he'd started when he lifted her from that broken coffin. Hope slept most of the journey, lulled by the rhythm of the wagon and the sound of Samuel's voice humming old songs. He'd packed everything carefully, her blanket, the bottles, the small wooden rattle he'd carved for her during their week together. Each mile that passed felt like saying goodbye in slow motion, like watching the sun set 1 degree at a time. The desert stretched endless on both sides of the road, marked by sagebrush and the bones of cattle that hadn't made it through the last drought. But Samuel found beauty in it now that he'd never seen before. The way morning light caught the red rocks and turned them to fire. The sound wind made when it moved through empty spaces. Hope had taught him to see the world as more than just a place where things ended. On the second day, they stopped to water the horses at a creek that ran clear and cold from somewhere deeper in the hills. Samuel sat in the shade with Hope on his lap, letting her play with his fingers while the animals drank. She was fascinated by everything: the way shadows moved, the sound of water over stones, the feel of grass beneath her small hands. "You won't remember me," he told her quietly, watching her try to catch a butterfly that danced just out of reach. "But I'll remember you. Every day, for the rest of my life, I'll remember the sound you made when you laughed and how you looked at me like I was worth something." The butterfly settled on Hope's blanket for a moment before floating away, and she watched it go with the serious expression of someone filing important information for later use. Samuel thought about how much she would see in the years ahead, how much she would learn and become. He wouldn't be there for any of it, but knowing it would happen was enough. Sweetwater appeared on the third day like a mirage made real, a cluster of buildings shimmering in the heat beside a river that gave the town its name. It was bigger than Broken Creek, with proper streets and painted signs and the kind of churches that had bell towers reaching toward heaven. Samuel felt small riding into it, like a man made of dust carrying something too precious for his rough hands. Martha and Thomas were waiting at the hotel, along with a woman Samuel recognized from the letters even before introductions were made. Hope's grandmother had the same dark hair, now streaked with silver, and the same gray eyes that seemed to hold secrets. Her name was Eleanor, and when she saw Hope, she began to cry without making a sound. "She looks just like Sarah did at that age," Eleanor whispered, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch Hope's cheek. "The same stubborn chin, the same way of watching everything like she's trying to figure out how the world works." Samuel held Hope a little tighter, feeling the minutes slip away like sand through his fingers. Soon he would have to let her go. Soon his arms would be empty again, and his cabin would return to silence. They walked together to Eleanor's house, a white cottage with blue shutters and a garden full of flowers that danced in the afternoon breeze. Samuel had never seen a place that looked more like home, had never imagined that houses could hold so much light. This was where Hope belonged, surrounded by people who shared her blood and her history, who could tell her stories about the mother she'd lost. In the parlor, surrounded by photographs and quilts and the smell of bread baking in the kitchen, Samuel finally placed Hope in Eleanor's arms. The baby went willingly, as if she recognized something familiar in her grandmother's touch. Eleanor held her carefully, like she was made of spun glass, while tears carved paths down her weathered cheeks. "Thank you," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for taking care of her, for keeping her safe when the world tried to throw her away." Samuel nodded, not trusting his voice to hold steady. He'd said goodbye to a lot of people in his 20 years of digging graves, but this was different. This wasn't about endings. This was about letting go of something that would keep growing, keep becoming, long after he was gone. Martha showed him the room they'd prepared for Hope, painted yellow like sunshine with a crib made of white wood and toys arranged on shelves like small promises of the future. There were books for when she was old enough to read, and clothes in sizes she hadn't grown into yet, and a rocking horse that waited patiently for someone to learn how to ride it. "She'll be loved here," Martha said, seeing how Samuel looked at everything with careful attention. "She'll never want for anything, never have to wonder if she belongs." Samuel touched the railing of the crib, thinking of the rough wooden box he'd made for her in his cabin. This was better. This was what she deserved. "Tell her about her mother," he said. "When she's old enough to understand, tell her about Sarah and John, and how they loved her before they had to let her go." That evening, Samuel sat on Eleanor's front porch, holding Hope one last time while the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and red. She was content in his arms, making small sounds that might have been attempts at words, or might have been just the music babies make when they're happy. "I have to go now," he whispered to her, though she was too young to understand. "I have to go back to the cemetery, back to my work. But you get to stay here and grow up surrounded by people who will love you your whole life long." Hope reached up and touched his face with her small hand, her fingers gentle against his scarred cheek. Samuel closed his eyes and memorized the feeling, storing it away with all the other precious things he would carry back to Broken Creek. When it was time to leave, Samuel handed Hope to Eleanor one final time. The older woman held the baby close, and Samuel saw on her face the same fierce protectiveness he'd felt during their week together. Hope would be safe here. Hope would be cherished. "If you ever want to visit," Eleanor said, "you'll always be welcome." She'll want to know about the man who saved her life. Samuel shook his head gently. "I didn't save her life. The storm did that. I just kept her safe until she could come home." The wagon ride back to Broken Creek felt longer than the journey out, stretched by the weight of empty arms and the echo of a baby's laugh that would live in Samuel's memory forever. But somewhere between Sweetwater and home, something shifted inside him. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it was different now. Softer somehow, mixed with something that might have been gratitude. When Samuel reached his cabin, he found a letter waiting on his table. Inside was a photograph of Hope in her grandmother's arms, both of them smiling at whoever held the camera. On the back, in careful handwriting, someone had written, "Lucy Eleanor McKenna Hope, age 7 months. With love and endless thanks." They'd given her his name as part of her own. The child he'd found would carry a piece of him with her always, would grow up knowing that her life had been touched by someone who chose love over loneliness, hope over despair. Samuel set the photograph on his mantle and looked out at the cemetery where it all began. Tomorrow there would be graves to dig, people to bury, endings to tend. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, Samuel McKenna felt like a man who had planted something instead of just putting things to rest. Some seeds, he realized, grow best when you're brave enough to let them go.